Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the chance to be here. I'm just delighted to be here and to welcome you at this sort of official opening of the SHEEO conference. And I want to begin by thanking Paul Lingenfelter and his colleagues at SHEEO for the opportunity to speak with you this morning and for what I think is a terrific agenda for this year's policy conference. It's always enjoyable for me to participate in a SHEEO meeting. I've spent a lot of time over the years, actually going back to the 1980s, at various events sponsored and expertly delivered by this organization, and I think many of you understand how important SHEEO is to the future of higher education in this country. Events like this also returned me to my roots in the higher education policy arena, which was essentially I call it my home turf, going back to the earliest days of my professional career. These kind of discussions at this conference give me a front row seat on policy developments at the state level, and that perspective is very important for the work that we're doing at Lumina Foundation today. In fact, I think as anyone who works in higher education knows, states really are where the action is, especially during these challenging times that is so accurately conveyed in the title of this year's policy conference. So all of you know that Lumina Foundation is focused on what we call Goal 2025, ensuring that by the year 2025, 60% of Americans hold high-quality college degrees, certificates, or other credentials. In this, all of us here hold common cause. Over 35 states now have specific, challenging goals for higher education attainment, and many of your goals are aligned with the 60% level of Lumina's, and in a few cases, they're even higher. So by now, the case for increased college attainment, I think, is well documented. Higher education leaders, policy leaders, editorial writers, even foundation CEOs, all have taken to heart the simple but powerful fact that 2/3 of all of the nation's jobs will require some form of post-secondary education by the end of the decade. But you know, we don't need to wait until then to see what's happening. Unemployment is arguably the nation's single biggest problem. In fact, it may be the issue that decides this year's presidential race. And many Americans now understand that it's directly tied to success in post-secondary education. Unemployment rates for those with college degrees are far lower, and this is especially true for recent college graduates. We also know that wage differentials for people with college degrees compared to those with high school credentials are wide. That's a fact I think we've known and understood for a long time. If you go to college, you make more money. But we now understand that the differential in wages is actually growing. Individuals with bachelor's degrees make an average of 84% more over the course of their lifetimes compared to those with just a high school diploma. The point is, that's an increase even since the late 1990s, when that differential was only about 75%. So these data and others show clearly that the labor market is hungry for college graduates. Even in this kind of a tight job market, employers are willing to pay an increasing premium for college graduates because more and more of these employers are having difficulty finding the kinds of skilled workers that they all need. The fanciful arguments of some pundits and even national newspapers and magazines against this reality, we think are simply wrong. And they send the wrong message to the very populations who we collectively need to increase their attainment levels. At Lumina, we'll challenge these arguments often, using facts and data to counter wishful thinking and denial. So I think it's safe to say that most, if not all of us in this room, are convinced that we need to raise attainment. But let me pause for a moment and ask the simple question. Can we? Can we actually increase higher education attainment in this country? I think the answer to that question must be an emphatic yes. We all know that far more people can succeed in post-secondary education if they're given the opportunity and the support they need. This means that higher education needs to be accessible and affordable. The pathways into and through the system need to be clear, and academic and social supports must be provided whenever needed. We know how to do all of these things, but we don't know how to do them at scale. We're beyond making tweaks to the current system, to the current way of doing things. Increasing attainment to 60% will require some fundamental shifts to higher education systems. I'm convinced that we'll get there, but let's be honest. We all know it's going to be very hard work. Now, last year I had a chance to meet and speak with Ken Rogoff. Many of you know this is the Harvard economist who wrote the brilliant bestseller on the financial crisis called This Time is Different. Of course, if you've read the book, you know that the title is ironic. This time is not at all different, as the book's subtitle, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly, makes clear. So I bring this up because I found myself thinking about Rogoff when I was preparing to speak with all of you. As I just said, we all understand that higher education is now integral to the economic vitality and to the security of our nation. We know that individual opportunity hinges primarily on success in post-secondary education. We don't need to be convinced that millions more Americans need to complete some form of post-secondary education. The funny thing is, most people we talk to are also convinced about these things too. I don't think convincing people, whether we're talking about elected officials or parents or anyone else, about the need to dramatically increase attainment is really our problem. But a lot of the people I talk to seem to need to be mobilized to actually take action on that. Sometimes they're looking for the quick fix, the one silver bullet that will change everything. Sometimes they just don't know what to do, and until someone tells them, they won't act, and nothing really changes. Sometimes they're trying lots of things, but they aren't following through to change systems based on what they learn about what works. They end up with little pockets of innovation, but nothing really changes. Those who really understand the problems that we face, also understand the scale of the change that's needed to solve it. They know systems of education and training will need to change on a massive scale. They know that educational performance, as measured by real learning, will have to increase dramatically. They know that we'll need to learn how to serve millions of students who we've never served especially well. Low-income students, first-generation students, students of color, and adult learners. Some of the people we're trying to convince to act are veterans of decades of efforts to improve K-12 education. And they're not convinced our efforts there have really made all that much of a difference. So I think a lot of people are convinced of the need to change higher education, but they're not convinced that change is possible. They've never seen education and training systems, much less colleges and universities, change all that much. Going back to Rogoff, I'm beginning to think that even if the financial crisis itself was not that different, our problem is convincing people that this time our response to it has to be different. I don't think it'll probably shock you to hear me say that I believe higher education's response especially must be dramatically different. Higher education will change more in the next few years than it has over the last several decades. Unfortunately, there's a danger that these changes will not all move us in the direction of a more inclusive and more effective higher education system. But we know a great deal now, more than we did just a few years ago, about the nature of the demands we face and the changes we can make that will increase attainment to the levels that our nation and our education system desperately needs. In particular, we're beginning to understand the large-scale changes that are needed to that higher education system. We need to build a higher education system focused on the needs of students and less on the needs of the higher education institutions. And it's critically important that we focus on today's students, the ever-growing numbers of those low-income, first-generation, minority, and adult students who constitute the real world on our college campuses today. I'd like to spend some time discussing two aspects of building this new student-centered system. The first is a new approach to financing higher education, And the second is the creation of a new national credentialing system. Yes, they're both big steps, so let's take each one in turn. The current student financing system, the model, is, in a word, broken. Today's tuition and student aid systems were designed decades ago to meet student needs and social and economic conditions that are dramatically different than those that we face today. The 18 to 22-year-old student who lives on campus and attends full-time is no longer the norm, far from it. And yet a student financing system designed largely to serve that student remains largely in place. Clearly, it's well past time to fundamentally rethink our national approach to student finance. We need a system in which resources are used to support the success of a much larger and infinitely more diverse population of students. Building this newly designed student financing system can't happen overnight, of course, but there are several criteria that we already know it should meet. For example, grants, loans, and tax credits, particularly at the federal level, need to be incorporated into a common system to meet a clear objective: supporting the success of low-income students. The system needs to feature strong incentives for students to complete programs and to do so as rapidly as possible. Policies governing tuition, financial aid, and institutional subsidies need to be aligned at the state and campus levels. The new system needs to incorporate new approaches to benefits management. The idea here is to assure that funds from sources other than financial aid, including income support like unemployment insurance and workforce development funds, are leveraged to support college attainment. Incentives need to encourage employers to dramatically increase their support for workers' post-secondary attainment. The new system needs to employ more efficient and more user-friendly eligibility and application processes at all levels. And finally, officials in this new system need to take a strong, student-oriented approach to monitoring the system's performance. Now, admittedly, this list of criteria for a new student financing model is just a series of broad brushstrokes right now. It will take a lot of work to fill in the details and forge a financing system that can effectively meet the needs of students and society. Still, that work must begin soon if we are going to reach that goal. Now, likewise, we need to begin soon to take that second step in building a more student-centered higher education system, a new system of credentials. Right now, we're operating under a system of credentials that's still far too closed and rigid to meet our needs. Despite the good work of faculty and others who've toiled to make assessment of learning an embedded element of the system, for the most part, it's still a system that primarily awards credit not for actual learning, but for time spent in classrooms or labs. It's a system in which the recognized levels of achievement, associates, bachelor's, master's degrees, doctorates, are too few, too widely spaced, and too loosely connected. It's a system in which valuable learning achieved outside of higher education is seldom recognized, though we're certainly encouraged by the recent traction in prior learning assessment. It's a system in which students, first-generation students in particular, often can't understand the pathways to degrees and other credentials. In short, it's a system based mainly on time rather than on learning. We need a new system of credentials to assure that high-quality learning is recognized and rewarded, no matter where or how that learning is obtained. There are a lot of benefits that will accrue from this more open credentialing system. It'll help employers and prospective workers to match skills and knowledge to available jobs. It'll help veterans, displaced workers, and other Americans earn credit and credentials for the skills and knowledge that they've gained on the job through workforce development programs or in the military. It'll create new opportunities for lifelong learning through stackable credentials that will open up multiple flexible pathways that individuals can take as their needs and their interests change. And finally, I think this new credentialing system will help millions of Americans obtain appropriate credit for high-quality learning that's gained through those newly developed or developing delivery systems like massive online open courses and competency-based programs and institutions. This shift to a learning-based, flexible, stackable credentialing system has been little more than an intriguing idea for quite some time. But now we think it's an idea whose time has come. Many of you have been involved with us in the development of the degree qualifications profile. The DQP is rapidly developing into a framework that we think can be used throughout higher education to transparently define the learning outcomes of degrees and other credentials. Our work on tuning, which several of your agencies have worked with us on, is showing how to constructively engage faculty in these kinds of efforts. Through the leadership of SHEEOs like John, the issue of defining and improving learning outcomes has risen to the top of policy agendas in several states. Of course, this new credentialing system doesn't take anything away from the civic purposes of higher education. The skills that serve us well in the workforce are, in fact, the very same skills that serve us well in life. We all know, and social science research, I think, shows us clearly that college-educated citizens are more globally aware, that they're more engaged, that they're more apt to make reasoned and ethical decisions than those who lack higher education. So these benefits will accrue to many more people in this new system. Now, I know that the changes that I'm suggesting here today are huge, but so are the challenges that we face. It won't do us much good to simply nibble around the edges of the current higher education system. Real change is urgently needed. And as is always the case in these kind of situations, real leadership is needed to bring about that change. That's where all of you come in. The simple fact is, none of the hard work necessary to build a student-centered system can succeed without knowledgeable and committed leadership at the state level. And that brings me back to my main theme for this morning, the new expanded role that SHEEOs and their staffs are going to need to play. In real and practical ways, all of you in this room must be leaders in the movement to increase attainment. That's because it's you who are the best equipped and the best positioned to revamp the post-secondary system so that it can reach that 60% attainment goal. After all, when it comes to system change, who better to lead that change than those of you who know the system best? Your positions are unique and they're vital for at least 3 reasons. First, you understand and are comfortable working with all of the stakeholders who have to cooperate in order to make these changes happen. You know how to navigate all types of terrain in your states, the higher education community, the policy arena, the workforce development space, the philanthropic community. That special position means you can be both a leader and a consensus builder, a connector and a catalyst for change. Second, your well-earned status as champions for higher education gives you great credibility with those in your state who might be resistant to change. After all, because you're a trusted friend of higher education, your embrace of a change agenda is more likely to sway others who might otherwise be wedded to the status quo. And finally, the I stress, relatively stable position of SHEEO agencies in many state higher education and policy infrastructures gives you time to effect meaningful change, at least more time than many of the other stakeholders in the system. Elected officials can come and go fairly quickly, and the same is true, ironically now, for institutional leaders. But SHEEOs, and especially their staffs, tend to be there for a longer haul. Actually, I think the agenda for this meeting tells me clearly that SHEEO as an organization is very much committed to this role. You're not shying away from these challenging times. On the contrary, the work that you're tackling here in the next couple days show me that you're moving forward to create a better system. You can see that in the workshops that were held yesterday on topics like regional sharing of student outcomes data and sustaining performance funding programs and quality assurance and learning outcome measurement. And you can see it in the issues that will be tackled later today, like innovative student aid programs, the use of common completion metrics, and new efforts to respond to workforce needs. You, perhaps more than any other group, appreciate the strengths and traditions of higher education, and yet can temper that appreciation with the realization that tradition alone won't prepare us for tomorrow. We need you to help lead us to tomorrow, one where all deserving students gain access to higher education, where all are supported until they reach their goals, and where all get an education that's rigorous, relevant in the modern economy, and ultimately rewarding to us all. Thank you very much.